Hello friends, myself Preeti Gajjar, lecturer in Computer Department. The subject is Advanced Database Management System and the unit name is Transaction Processing. Today we are going to learn about the topic is Basics of Transaction Processing. Objectives. After watching this video, you will be able to learn about what is transaction. So the introduction to transaction concepts, example of transaction, operation of transaction, and transaction execution and problems. Introduction to transaction concepts. If some user delete all rows of table by mistake and it is too late to realize on mistake, so what can be done now? How we can recover or how we can get those data back? So transaction processing comes in picture here. It provides the way to save work permanently or undo the mistakes. Consider the situation: withdrawal of rupees 1000 and 2000 from account having 5000 balance. It may leave balance 4000 or 3000 accordingly, while the correct value here is 2000. So the concurrency control comes in a picture here to prevent such kind of anomalies. So if we have a 5000 in balance and we are withdrawing 1000, then the remaining result is 4000, right? And if we have a 5000 as a balance and we are withdrawing 2000, then the remaining balance must be 3000. But instead of that, the actual result in the record is rupees 2000. So it creates a problem and the answer 2000 is not correct here. So to prevent this kind of situations, concurrency control is used to prevent such kind of anomalies, or we can say a problem. Basic concept. First we can say what is the definition of transaction, and it is a transaction is a set of database operations that are performs particular task. So transaction is a set of number of database operations, and all these operations ultimately generates one particular task. A transaction can be considered as an action or a series of actions. These actions are carried out by a single user or application program to perform operations. Let's see the example of transaction. Consider a particular task, say a fund transfer from one account to another account. So consider the situation where we have two accounts and we want to move some amount of rupees from one account to another. So this task involves updating balance in two source and destination accounts for one amount. As we are taking some money from one account, so the value is going to change and we are adding that value to another account, so again that basic value is going to change. So two source and destination accounts are going to change. So there are two operations, one to debit account and second to credit account. So when we complete this task, it is known as a one transaction. List of operations of transactions. Which type of operations whenever the transaction is going to execute it are going to operate, and these are retrieve. Ultimately it is a read operation, so to retrieve data stored in a database. Insert, it is a basically a write operation, so to store new data in a database. Delete, it is also a write operation to delete existing data from a database. Update, it is also a write operation to modify existing data in a database. Commit, to save the work done permanently. Rollback, to undo the work done. So with this list of operations like retrieve, insert, update, delete, commit and rollback, we can perform different operation in a transaction. Here is the important topic: transaction execution and problems. How the transaction is going to start, how it ends, how it's and what it's operated during the starting to ending point, which are the process. So it is known as a state transition diagram, and in that, as you can see in the figure, transaction begins in the left side. This is the transaction begin. So when any transaction begins, it starts suddenly in a active state. And in active state, either it is in a any kind of a basic operation, it can be a read or it can be a write operation. After active state, a transaction can be entered in a two-way. Either it goes to partially committed or it goes to abort. So if transaction ends partially, then it goes to partially committed state. That means whatever the change is done in the database or in during the operation, they are going to partially committed in the buffer area, and again it moves ahead to the commit operation and in the state of committed. So in state transition diagram, whenever any data is going to committed, it is previously partially committed, and then when commit is going to perform, permanently that data will be stored in the system. After committed, the transaction is going to end, so it moves to the next level and it is terminated. That means here your transaction is in end position, it is completed totally. In active, from the active state, we said that there are two ways. One is going to partially committed, so we complete that part, and now if it is not in a partially committed mode, then it moves to a abort state. It moves to a failed state. That means the transaction is aborted, or we can say cancelled due to any causes, right? So from the active state, suddenly some problem arises, some error occurs, and the transaction is in the mode of failed state. And if the transaction is failed, it is ultimately in the end situation, so it is again moved to the next state and it is terminated. So once this transaction is going to start or in a begin situation, it in some way or after in some time, it is in a terminated or in a end situation. In between, the transaction is going to either partially committed and then terminate, or either the second way is when it starts in from the active state, it goes to failed state and then terminated. Another situation is possible after active state it goes to partially committed, and then if some problems occurs or error occurs, then it goes to failed state directly from the partially committed state, and these changes will not permanently stored, so it is not going to entered in a committed state. And from the partially committed, where the changes are temporarily stored in a buffer area, those changes are going to in a next state, and it is a failed state. If any error occurs, any cause generated, then from the partially committed it moves to the failed state. Ultimately, as the transaction reaches to failed state, it goes to the terminated state. So now here also in a third way, from the active to partially committed to failed and terminated. So these are three different ways generated when one transaction starts, either it is in a read mode or in a write mode. So 5 different states are active, partially committed, committed, failed, and terminated. This figure is known as a state transition diagram. So here in detail, as I explained the figure, the concept is written in different 5 states. In active, once a transaction begins in execution, it will immediately be in this state. Various read and write operations are performed on database in this state. Second is partially committed. When transaction ends, that means all read and write operations are performed, it moves to partially committed state. Third is committed. A transaction enters in committed state if it has partially committed and it can be ensured that it will never be aborted. Once a transaction is committed, its effect must be made permanent even if there is a failure. This is the responsibility of a database management system software to ensure this. That means once the transaction enters in a committed state, all the affected data must be stored in a database system. Next is aborted, or we can say failed or cancelled state. A transaction enter in this state, or a transaction may be aborted if it itself detects some unrecoverable error during its execution, such as withdrawing amount from an account having no sufficient balance. If the transaction is aborted, the DBMS either kills the transaction or restart the execution of a transaction. So if the transaction enters in a failed state, then what we can do after this failed situation? So there are two ways: either we can cancel or we can kill the transaction, or we can restart that again, right? Next is terminated. A transaction enters this state either from committed state or from abort state. Depending upon this, a database will be in a new consistent state or in previous consistent state. So if the transaction enters in a terminated state from the committed state, then the database will be in a new consistent state, and if the transaction enters in terminated from the failed state, then it rollbacks all the data and the database will be in a previous consistent state. So these are the 5 different states of transaction. Thank you.